Hi, I'm Ted Pattison of Critical Path Training. In this session, we're going to look at using the SharePoint tools built into Visual Studio 2010 to add SharePoint project items, or SPIs. So I'm going to go through a couple slides that explain the concepts, and then I'm going to work through a demonstration of adding two different web parts to a project created with the SharePoint tools. Now, a SharePoint project item, or as we call it, an SPI, is something that you add to a Visual Studio project just with a standard project item template. But what's really neat about the design of SPIs is typically they have more than one file. Every single SPI is going to have its own folder inside of the Visual Studio project, and inside there we're going to have one or more files. Now, the kind of SPIs that you're going to work with are what we think of as kind of high-level building blocks of a SharePoint solution. A web part is an SPI. A list definition is an SPI. A application page is an SPI. And what's really neat about it is that it has multiple files inside, but each individual file has its own specific purpose and could be compiled into the DLL, could be deployed somewhere inside the layouts directory, or might not be deployed at all. Now, if we look at the screenshot in the slide below, you'll see that here's a project that has three different SPIs. Each one has its own folder, and inside that folder, you can see the one for a document library, has quite a few files behind it, including page templates for things such as the user interaction. Now, there's also a approval workflow, which is an SPI that has a class and an element.xml file. And then there's an event handler, which once again has an elements.xml file and a CS file. Now, the real magic that makes the SPI such a great abstraction to make SharePoint development easy is that each one of the files inside of a SPI tracks what type of deployment it requires. For instance, if you look down at this visual web part, you're going to see that, well, it has an elements.xml file. That's an element manifest. So that has to go into one of the project features, and it's going to basically have a definition of declarative elements that need to be provisioned during feature activation. Well, the next one is a .cs file. What does that have to do during deployment? Nothing. That's going to be compiled into the project's output DLL, but the CS file can just be left alone. Now, the next file, the .webpart file, well, that goes into a feature, but that becomes an element file that then needs to be provisioned up into the web part gallery during feature activation. And finally, as you'll see, a visual web part has a user control, a .ascx file. And so that's going to be recognized as a template file, and you could see that there's a deployment path where that gets pushed out into the control templates directory inside the SharePoint root files directory. Now, we're going to create a SharePoint project item just by going and grabbing one of the project templates and adding it to our project. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started by doing the demo, where I'll just take an existing project, which is a SharePoint project, and add a couple different SPIs. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, here is a Visual Studio project I've already created with the SharePoint tools. It doesn't have any SPIs yet, but it has a feature named main, and note that my feature is scoped to the site level. Now, I'm going to add my first SPI as a web part. So if I go down here and I go to the Project Add menu, I want to add a new item. So if I look at all these, let's make them a little bit smaller so you can see all these. You can see that Visual Web Part and Web Part are both project items, and adding one of these results in the creation of an SPI. In fact, all of the different project item templates result in creating SPIs. Let's create a Web Part. We won't be very creative. We'll just leave it as Web Part 1, and we'll go ahead and we'll add that to our project. Now, as we can see, the Web Part itself gets its own folder. So also note that SPIs can have their own property settings. So as an example, a web part has a SPI property called deployment conflict resolution. So there's this issue in web part development that when you put the .webpart file into a feature and then you activate the feature, the .webpart file gets added to the webpart gallery for the target site collection. Well, if I deactivate and reactivate the feature because I've made some changes to the .webpart file, there's this problem where the original .webpart file is still there. So as the feature tries to provision the updated .webpart file into the webpart gallery, it silently fails because there's already a webpart file there. So what the deployment conflict resolution of the webpart SPI does is during deployment, it looks at the target site collection and looks to the webpart gallery. And if it's trying to provision a .webpart file and another .webpart file of the same name already exists, it deletes it as part of the deployment process. Now also we can see these individual elements down here inside of the SPI folder. Now elements.xml, let's go ahead and make the property sheet a little bit easier to see right here. You can see that it's recognized as an element manifest. You can also see it has a location where it's going to push this out inside the feature directory. Now there's also the .cs file. That's recognized as a deployment type of no deployment. And then finally the .webpart file is a file element. Also note that if I go back and take a look at the feature, that this SPI got pushed into this particular feature because activation of this feature is what's going to take the elements.xml element manifest and basically provision the elements that are inside there. Now, I haven't really done much but talk, but here's what I need to do when I add a new web part. First of all, let's go to the .webpart file. So note that a lot of the things in the .webpart file I don't need to change. It's got the name of the type. It's got the name of the assembly. Note that the SharePoint tools has some substitutable placeholders in here that they do a substitution on when they build the solution package, so they actually put the real project name. Now, the name of this will be Ted's first web part. So that's going to be the name that users will see when they create the web part. What's the description? Well, let's just go ahead and put some text in there that we'll see a little bit later when we create the web part. So really all I did is I opened this up and I changed the title. If I wanted to, I could add a bunch more properties to initialize the web part so it has no Chrome or title and border or border only. Second thing we'll do, after we've modified the .webpart file, let's look at the elements.xml file. I open up the elements.xml file. Now, one issue that we have is when the .webpart file gets created up in the webpart gallery, here's the name of the file that's going to be created. And so one of the things that I might decide to do is I might want to append the project name to the beginning of this just to avoid conflict with other solutions that might have another web part of the same name, webpart1. And then finally, there is a group and there's a value of custom. Let's go ahead and name this Contoso Web Parts. And we'll see as we go through the UI, that they're going to take the web parts and group them by whatever the group value name is. Now finally, there is a .cs file inside here, and if I go ahead and I open that up and take a look inside, well, there's not much here. I don't want to really do too much inside the implementation of the web part itself. So all I'm going to do is go back to render contents, and we'll do a writer.write, and we'll say something like, hello from the VS2010 SharePoint tools. Okay, so now that we have our basic web part, we're ready for web part deployment. Now, before I run this, now the feature is already up here, it's inside the site. What I'm going to do before I build and deploy is I'm going to go to Project Properties and I'm going to switch my active deployment configuration back to default so that the site collection level feature gets activated at the end. So let's go ahead and now choose deploy. I go ahead and choose deploy, and now Visual Studio moves through the steps of building the solution package, pushing the solution package out by installing it and deploying it, and then at the very end it activates the main feature, and I see that there were no errors. If I come back here and I go ahead and refresh this, I should be able to see that my feature was activated as part of the deployment process. So as this comes back, now I can see that this is activated. One other thing that we want to look at, let's go to Site Settings, and now let's go under Galleries and look at the Web Part Galleries. If I go look at my Web Part Gallery right here, one of the things that we should be able to see is that inside of the Web Part Gallery, the .webpart file that I was working on should exist inside there. Now also note that I felt the need to append the solution name in front of the webpart file name. And the reason we do that is to ensure uniqueness, to basically prevent file name conflicts. The webpart gallery is one of those things where if there's a file name conflict, whoever got loaded there first generally wins. Now, when this comes back right here, there's a little timeout that it does because it's going off host and I don't have a network connection. That's why it took a second there. But notice that there's my .webpart file. Notice that it put it in the Contoso webparts group. Okay. Now, after the feature gets activated, if I go back here and I go to this page and I go into Edit Page, let's go through the steps of actually putting a web part on the page. I'll go ahead and click the web part zone and say Add a web part. And now if I go down to Contoso web parts, there's my web part right there. Let's go ahead and add that web part. And now I've got my first Hello World up and working. Okay, so with that level of success, let's go back and add a second web part. We'll go back to Visual Studio. Let's close some of the things that we've been working with. And this time, we'll add in a second web part, but this time we'll add a visual web part. And we'll call this one Web Part 2. Now, the difference between a regular web part and a visual web part is that a visual web part is based on a user control. So here's my user control that gets created. Now, if I go and look at my Web Part 1 versus Web Part 2, I still have the same idea of deployment config resolution. And really the only difference between these is that now this web part has extra files for the user control. It's got a .ascx file that we can see the deployment type is template file, and the user control also has a code behind file associated with it and a designer file. Now let's go ahead and open the same files that I did with the first web part. Let's start by opening the .webpart file, and inside the .webpart file we'll call this one Ted's second web part, and we'll just call that my visual web part. It's a good description for that. Now inside the elements.xml file, once again, let's go ahead and add the name of the solution as the first part of the .webpart file name as to avoid conflict. And then let's go to the value of the group and put in Contoso web parts as the name of the particular group. And now I'm done with this file. Let's close this down. And then instead of writing code behind this web part, code's already written behind the web part. If I want to look at the code behind the actual web part file, there's just some very generic code that takes the user control and calls a page.load and adds that to the controls collection of the web part itself. So really the work that I need to do can be done all inside the user control. Let's go to the user control. Let's now go take it into design view. And just to do something very simple here, to do hello world, I'm going to look at my toolbox right here, and let's drop down a button. And now that I've got a button in place right here, let's go ahead and also add a label. And certainly I should go ahead and rename these. But in this case right here, just to kind of get a instant gratification, let's double click on the button and notice that it creates an event handler for me. And now that we have a event handler down there, let's go ahead and say label1.text equals, and then we'll just put in the current date and time. Date time dot now dot toLong time string, and that will suffice just to get a demo and see that everything works properly. Now, I've done as much as I need to do to go ahead and deploy and see the work that we've done out there. But what I want to do here is put up the output window, and this time as I make the output window larger, and we'll go ahead and we'll do a deploy. This starts running and skipping deployment step, retracting. Now look at this. Found one deployment conflict resolving. So what it noticed is that there was already a Contoso webparts_webparts1.webpart file there. And so potentially I might have made changes to that file, so it deleted the file inside the site collection so it could write the new version of the file up there during feature activation. Okay, now that we've done that, let's go back to our site. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page and realize that IS was reset by Visual Studio as I deployed my solution, so it's going to take just a second for the page to refresh. But once the page comes back, I'm going to go back into edit mode. I'm going to go ahead and click on Add Web Part. And now, as I look into Contoso Web Parts, I see my second web part. Let's go ahead and add that in. Now there's my second web part inside here. Let's go ahead and get out of editing mode, just back to regular browse mode. And I go ahead and click the button, and basically the code behind there runs without any problem. So just to recap what I did, we created a Visual Studio project that had two different SPIs. Both of the SPIs I used in this example were web parts, but each SPI can track as many files as needed to handle some type of component creation. In this case, a web part with a user control behind it requires a couple different CSS files for the code behind the web part, the code behind the user control. We need an elements.xml file to be able to take the .webpart file and provision an instance of it in the web part gallery, and then there's the user control. And because of the deployment type attribute of every file, the Visual Studio tools can do the right thing with each file while giving you a very nice logical view of your SPI and putting all the files that you need to edit for the web part together.